Good evening, everyone. My name is Antonia Wunderlich, and on behalf of the British-German Association, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this online event. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, the BGA is a charity and membership organisation that promotes mutual understanding and good relations between the UK and Germany. Part of what we do is to provide a vibrant forum for debates, talks, discussions, and learning about British-German relations. So we regularly put on events such as this one, along with other initiatives such as our monthly newsletter and our podcast series. Today's event will be a timely conversation on the Windsor Framework, and we are delighted to welcome as our distinguished guest speakers Catherine Barnard, Professor of EU Law and Employment Law at the University of Cambridge, and Katy Hayward, Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University, Belfast, as well as John Peat, The Economist's political and Brexit editor, who will be moderating tonight's discussion. Before handing over to John, a quick note on the technology. We encourage you to submit your questions throughout the event, so please send in any questions via the Q&A function, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you click on it, you can start typing up and sending in questions. You also have the option to like someone else's question, and the more likes a question gets, the higher up it goes on the list. So on that note, over to you, John.
Well, thank you, Antonia. Thank you for inviting me to chair this event, which I will do with minimal intervention on my part. Just to tell you sort of where we are. I mean, I would say something like 5 or 6 weeks earlier this year, we kept being told, oh, there's another breakthrough on some aspect of the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's about access to data, or it's about some other deal. Then it would be denied, and then people would say we're still negotiating. Then sometimes they would be saying we're in a negotiation tunnel, and it went on like this for some weeks. And then suddenly on February the 27th, if I've got the right date, Rishi Sunak and von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, reached an agreement. At one point, they were going to call it, I think, the Windsor Treaty, but they decided not to do that because there is a Treaty of Windsor, which I think is something like 500 years old. But instead, they lit on the idea of renaming the Northern Ireland Protocol the Windsor Framework, with a new deal that would minimise, but not eliminate, checks. And Rishi Sunak, I think, described it as more or less eliminating the sense of a border in the Irish Sea, which we might hear more about later. So to tell us more about how the deal was struck, what it might imply, and what it might mean for the future of UK-EU relations and UK-German and UK-French relations, I'm going to hand over first of all to Catherine Barnard from Trinity College, Cambridge, and then when she's spoken for something like 10, 12 minutes, Katy Hayward will tell us a little bit more, particularly from the Northern Ireland end. So Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Just before I go any further, John, can you see the slides?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to the Windsor Agreement, the problems that it was intended to address, and a little bit about how it has addressed those problems. And then I'll give the floor to Katy, who will talk to you about the politics, both before, during, and what is likely to come. So just to remind you, we'll just talk about the issue that had to be addressed. And that was, of course, that the UK was going to leave the single market and the customs union. But the problem was how to deal with the fact that in respect of just getting the laser pointer out, that in respect of Northern Ireland has the only contiguous border with the single market. And the Good Friday Agreement is understood to say, although it doesn't actually say in terms, that there will be no hard border between the north and south of Ireland. And this presented the problem of what's known as the Brexit trilemma. And the Brexit trilemma is that you can only have two of the three things. So if the UK is to lead the single market and the customs union, there clearly needs to be a border somewhere so that the EU can control goods that are going into the south from Northern Ireland. And if that's the case, if there can't be a border here between the north and the south, there's got to be a border somewhere. And that border is down the Irish Sea, what's known as the east-west border. Now, you might recall that Theresa May actually contemplated not leaving the customs union for the UK as a whole. And in that way, if she did not leave the customs union, then there wouldn't need to be a border between the north and the south, and there wouldn't need to be a border between the east and the west. But that, as you know, was essentially blocked in the various meaningful votes. And when Boris Johnson took over, Boris Johnson said, right, we're definitely leaving the single market and the customs union. We won't have a north-south border because there's two of the Brexit trilemma. Therefore, there has to be a border between Northern Ireland and GB, the so-called east-west border, the border down the Irish Sea. Now, Boris Johnson always denied that there was a trilemma because Boris Johnson said, actually, we're not going to have a border here either. I'm afraid this was fundamentally incorrect. It was quite clear when you looked at the text of the withdrawal agreement, which was the divorce text which contained the Northern Ireland Protocol. The impact assessment on it made it absolutely clear at the time that there would be a border down the Irish Sea. There would be checks on goods going into Northern Ireland, and indeed there would be tariffs to pay potentially as well. And so it was well known that there would be an east-west border, but also there would be a border, although less pronounced, on goods going from Northern Ireland to GB. The GB Northern Ireland side was by far the most important because a huge volume of retail trade in Northern Ireland comes from GB. So the question then was how to deal with this as an issue. The DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, although having initially supported the Northern Ireland Protocol, started to become aware of the implications of having an east-west border. Although, of course, here, this poster is flagging up both no north-south border, no east-west border communities against Brexit. And although Katy will be too modest to say this, she's done a brilliant book on borders, which you might want to refer to. So we have the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the Northern Ireland Protocol was agreed by Boris Johnson in 2019, the autumn of 2019, with a view to be able to say that he'd got Brexit done in time for the 2019 elections. And he made the Northern Ireland Protocol the so-called front stop. You might recall there was Theresa May talked about the protocol being a backstop if nothing else could be sorted out. Now, what's in the Northern Ireland Protocol? First of all, it's worth noting that there's a provision which says that a number of EU directives on equality matters will apply in Northern Ireland and apply on a dynamic basis. And some people say it goes further than that, and the provisions cover not just equality matters, but also other social policy measures of the EU. And then you've got the meat of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and essentially Article 5 is the key provision. And Article 5 says that any goods which are at risk of going from GB, NI into the south will be subject to the checks and thus the border down the Irish Sea. Although the protocol talks about no customs duties, in fact, if those goods risk going into the south, there would be some customs duties and checks. We also see in the Northern Ireland Protocol that there was a long list of EU rules which would apply to Northern Ireland on a dynamic basis. In other words, when they got updated, they would apply to Northern Ireland, but the Northern Ireland Protocol made no provision for Northern Irish input into the updating of that legislation. You've then got other provisions, I won't go into details, but the most controversial provision were the institutional provisions which gave a role for the European Court of Justice. And a lot of DUP members and also hardcore Brexiteers said there shouldn't be a role for the European Court of Justice. How come that a foreign court has a say over UK territory? Well, the EU's answer to that is there's lots of EU rules which apply, and if EU rules apply, then the ultimate arbiter of EU rules is the ECJ. In addition, and I think Katy will be talking about this, there is a consent mechanism in the Northern Ireland Protocol to be used for the first time before the end of 2024, where there can be a vote on the continued application of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So that is a thumbnail sketch of what was in the Northern Ireland Protocol. As we know, the UK government in June of 2022 published the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which in essence turned off a number of these provisions, or at least gave ministers power to turn them off and put their own scheme in place. That bill was widely regarded as breaching the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol and thus being in breach of international law. However, the UK government, particularly Liz Truss, argued that the bill was essential in order to be able to get the EU to the negotiating table and get the EU to see sense that something needed to be done about the Northern Ireland Protocol because it wasn't working on the ground. I think saner voices perhaps recognise that it wasn't the force of the Northern Ireland Protocol that got the EU to the table, but a change of Prime Minister, a more constructive approach and more constructive engagement from the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, and also more constructive engagement from pretty hardcore Brexiteers, Chris Heaton-Harris and Steve Baker, who were in charge of, who were Secretary of State and Minister for Northern Ireland. So let's have a look at this Windsor Framework Agreement. So what's in the Windsor Framework? And indeed, we are going to be encouraged to call it the Windsor Framework going forward instead of the Northern Ireland Protocol. In fact, it is rather complicated. There are a number of documents which largely build on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And those documents include declarations, unilateral declarations, which aren't legally binding, policy documents, but also at the core is a what's called a decision of the Joint Committee. And that decision is legally binding and does a lot of heavy lifting. Now, that joint decision, it does have the effect of amending parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And for those of you who are lawyers, if I may, I would just say something legal, which will turn most people's stomachs. But there is a fundamental question about how do you amend the Northern Ireland Protocol? Because it's an international agreement. Well, what has been decided is that there were powers in the withdrawal agreement in Article 164.5D, which I have flagged up here, that it says that it's possible to amend the withdrawal agreement, including the Northern Ireland Protocol, for up to 4 years following the end of the transition period to adopt decisions amending the agreement, providing that such amendments are necessary to correct errors, to address omissions or other deficiencies, or to address situations unforeseen when this agreement was signed, and provided that such decisions may not amend the essential elements of the agreement. Now, in my view, what you find in the Joint Committee draft decision is a pretty generous reading of dealing with deficiencies. But the very fact is that there's still a role for the ECJ in the Windsor Agreement, because they realise, both sides realise, that you cannot use this deficiencies power to amend the essential elements of the agreement, and taking out the ECJ would do just that. So, coming back from legal technicalities, what you see is that the Northern Ireland Protocol is a bit like the backbone, or it's a bit like the Christmas tree, and then added onto that Christmas tree are all of these various declarations, joint decisions, recommendations. The EU also has produced a a list of documents which are essentially EU legislation which it's going to amend. It's worth reading the press releases from both sides, but of particular interest are the Q&A from the Commission, which are well written and widely thought to be a bit more unspun than the white paper that you find here, which is the UK government's version. Now, of course, you've got to see from both sides have got different interests. The UK government has got to be able to say the Windsor Agreement is totally new and we've achieved something to try and placate the DUP and the ERG. The EU's position is nothing has changed really, because they don't want to worry member states that there has been a backdoor amendment to the treaty. So I think the UK document slightly oversells the agreement. The Q&A from the Commission slightly undersells what's been achieved. And so the reality is we are meeting somewhere in the middle. The most significant substantive change in respect of trade is the introduction of the red lane, green lane. Now, this is something the UK government had been talking about. In fact, so had the EU. So it was always likely that something would happen here. Now, there is an amendment to the Northern Ireland Protocol and a recognition that the UK's internal market remains intact, that Northern Ireland is part of the territory, and if goods are destined for final consumption or final use in Northern Ireland, they will generally not be subject to checks. Now, this is the UK government's representation of the red lane, green lane. What we know is that there will be an expanded version of the Trusted Traders Scheme, and the Trusted Traders Scheme will allow traders to be able to import goods into Northern Ireland, largely without the volume of checks that were before, but it's incorrect to say that there are no checks at all. A trusted trader can also sell on once into Northern Ireland. And the reason why this Trusted Trader Scheme will be expanded and a green lane approach will be adopted is because there has been much more data sharing. It's one of the key shifts that occurred in after Christmas when the UK said we will share data in real time with the EU so that they can see what's going on. Now, the Trusted Trader Scheme can be suspended at any stage if it looks like there is an abusive process. But goods which are destined for the EU will still be subject to all of the checks that are listed there. So considerable amounts of paperwork. What does it mean? Well, with this green lane, the government says the green lane removes any sense of a border down the Irish Sea. I'm not sure that's quite correct. There will be some checks, especially on agri-food, so plant and animal products, especially on high-risk products like fresh meat and dairy. But clearly there is a reduction in the number of checks, and customs paperwork will be submitted, but on a monthly basis, the paperwork will concern whole loads rather than each consignment, so it will reduce the paperwork. And there's more details here, we can go into it. I realize it's not probably for this audience of particular interest, but there will still be checks, albeit with lower frequency, on agri-foods. Where there aren't any changes, somewhat surprisingly, is in respect of state aid rules. State aid is where the government gives some sort of benefit to businesses in Northern Ireland, or indeed in the rest of the United Kingdom, which benefits Northern Ireland. Those rules have not been changed. And furthermore, as I've already indicated to you, the role of the Court of Justice has not been affected either. Although the UK government said because the EU has reduced the number of rules which apply to Northern Ireland, therefore the area of jurisdiction of the Court of Justice is being reduced. The EU says it will take a number of unilateral measures, which again is positive and shows that there is good trust and cooperation on both sides. The final issue is sovereignty. Now, the hardcore Brexiteers have taken a very tough line on sovereignty, and they say that the EU should have no say whatsoever over what's going on in Northern Ireland. They particularly wanted the removal of the Court of Justice, and as I've also explained, the EU would never have accepted that. But what we do see is a more nuanced approach to sovereignty, and that takes a couple of forms. First and foremost, you have what's called the Stormont break, and that's the issue that's attracted most attention. So Stormont will have some say over EU laws which apply, which have been amended and apply in Northern Ireland. Now, the Stormont break, however, is subject to really, really strict conditions. This is the IFG's first attempt at trying to explain how the Stormont break will operate. But what you need to know is that the Stormont break cannot be engaged unless there are 30 MLAs, members of the Legislative Assembly, from at least two parties agreeing to trigger that break. Now, as Katy will explain in more detail, at the moment, of course, the Northern Ireland Assembly Stormont is not sitting, so it's conditional on Stormont getting back into session. The Stormont break can only be triggered where there are serious concerns about the content of updated EU law or where it will significantly impact on everyday life. The Stormont break can only be pulled in exceptional circumstances and as a last resort. All of this points to the fact that it really is an extreme measure, unlikely to be used, but because it's seen as something of a nuclear weapon, but it's there in the case of an emergency. But I think of more practical use is there is clearly going to be much more engagement with Northern Ireland executive, legislature and other stakeholders before measures are actually adopted to avoid the emergency break from being pulled. So in conclusion, I would say this is a good deal. It's good for Northern Ireland. It's good too for the UK and the EU's better relationship. What we're seeing is a lot of new rules, a lot of data sharing and greater administrative cooperation. The UK will pay a price for its responsibility as a third country policing the EU's external border, but I think it's a price that they're prepared to pay to try and resolve the issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol and for the UK and the EU to move on. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Catherine. That was very comprehensive. I now hand down the floor to Katy, who will talk a bit more particularly about how this has all gone down in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the British German Association for the invitation. So yeah, I'm just going to cover the question of how we got here to the Windsor Framework Agreement and consider the reaction in Northern Ireland to it and also potential issues. So as Catherine's already mentioned, we're here because we have seen a step change in the relationship between the UK and the EU. And one thing that's been very obvious and one thing that people have commented on here in Northern Ireland has been the warmth that appeared to be there in the relationship between the Prime Minister and President von der Leyen. And that has been lacking for such a long time. We also see it in James Cleverly as Foreign Secretary and Maroš Šefčovič from the EU Commission. So all this is positive, and of course that changes a context in which we've seen such an agreement reached. And where you see warmth in the UK-EU relationship, that bodes well too then for the British-Irish relationship, which is all important for Northern Ireland, of course. So we've got that straight up. The second thing that we've had that enabled us to get to this point is evidence. So what was one of the problems with the protocol as it originally stood was that it was designed without having much knowledge, even of the essentials in terms of what was coming from Britain into Northern Ireland, what that trading relationship looked like, because of course it was internal to the UK. So over the last 2 years, just as we haven't had the full implementation of the protocol, we have had a gathering of evidence in the sense of what actually crosses the Irish Sea and what goes into the Republic of Ireland and what doesn't. So this enabled the judgment of officials on both sides and then ultimately politicians to say, this is actually not a risk to the single market. And most of these goods that are coming with in retail through supermarkets that are sort of consumer facing, they stay in Northern Ireland. So we had that data, which was all important. We also had evidence put forward from businesses about the negative impacts of the protocol and concerns that they had around very particular issues. This included farmers, of course, a really important constituency in Northern Ireland. And we also had evidence to go on in terms of polling, some of which is being conducted by my colleague David Finnemore and I here in Queen's, regular polling around the concerns that people have on the protocol and also what they valued. So, for example, in that polling, we saw that the question of customs declarations on parcels was a top issue of concern that people had. And we've seen this addressed to a considerable degree in the Windsor Framework. Another thing that made the difference was engagement. And Antonio, you mentioned around in the BGA, the objective of mutual understanding and good relations. And of course, that takes some effort. And we've definitely seen that effort expended, particularly from the EU side and including our German friends. And I will just pay tribute to Bernd Lange and David McAllister in their respective roles in the European Parliament, but also parliamentarians such as Marcus Tuns from the SDP, just directly engaging with Northern Ireland. We've seen this also from the German ambassador to the UK and many others in the German embassy, directly engaging with people here and then getting better understanding of the concerns. And that has made a considerable difference, I think, in allowing the flexibility that is needed to be shown in this particular case. Ultimately, I think the Windsor Framework is obviously a stepping point. It's the beginning of the next stage. It's a good demonstration of what my colleague Mary Murphy and I described it some time back about the EU's engagement with Northern Ireland, and that is the soft power of commitment. It requires that sort of relationship building, and we're hoping to see that continue. So in terms of the reaction, we saw, as John mentioned, there was a lot of build up to the announcements on the 27th, and when that came, it was a bit of a whirlwind. And there was immediate visit then by the Prime Minister here, a lot of photo ops and a lot of sound bites around it. What was notable here in Northern Ireland was the cautious welcome that came from business, very cautious welcome, and the fact that there wasn't an immediate reaction really from political parties, with the notable exception of a couple of DUP MPs who came out saying that their gut feeling was that this was not a good deal for Northern Ireland. Those MPs closely associated with the ERG, and there wasn't too much surprise in them coming out in opposition. In contrast, we've seen wider unionism be very cautious, say that they're going to study the deal and study the detail, think about its implications. This is true of the Ulster Unionist Party as well as the DUP, sort of the moderate Ulster Unionist Party and the DUP. For nationalists, again, cautious welcome. Notably, we've seen from Sinn Féin an intention to sort of overlook the red, white and blue of this Windsor Framework. You saw the front cover, as Catherine had there in the image. There's no Republic of Ireland, apparently, that exists anymore. It's blank below the Irish border. We see that sort of idea sort of very much present in the command paper, and a lot of the spin about it that it's meant to reassure unionists, and nationalists have decided not to react negatively to that. The non-aligned, the Alliance Party, again, fundamentally welcoming the fact that we have a UK-EU deal, an agreement, but being a bit cautious in terms of saying anything definitive about what it means for Northern Ireland. In terms of the public reaction, so we've just got our first polling results on the Windsor Framework, and we see 67%, this is Lucid Talk's poll for the Belfast Telegraph, 67% say they welcome it, 27% against. Now, I'm not at all surprised to see those figures, given that we have seen in our other polling and in other forms of research in Northern Ireland, there is a strong constituency who is opposed to the protocol, not because of what it means in terms of the seaboard or access to GB goods, but in terms of principle, what it means for Northern Ireland's place in the Union. And this is coming from many reasons and causes for unionists' sense of anxiety and insecurity at the moment, not least of which is a lack of trust in the British government. So in that polling, the DUP are coming out at 73% against. Again, I'm not surprised to see that, given that we know that the DUP supporters, and in fact, pretty much all party supporters here, followed their party's lead in their response to things over the protocol and their views on that. The fact that we haven't had DUP leadership coming out yet for or against clearly helps us see that for the moment, DUP supporters are just sticking with where they were before, which is extreme skepticism and wariness. One thing that we have seen changed with this Windsor Framework is Ulster Unionist Party supporters, so the moderate unionists, do have a majority supporting the Windsor Framework and welcoming it. So we may well see, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the Ulster Unionist Party leadership also saying that they accept the deal. So to potential issues, there are a few of these. This is not to say that the actual fact of it is not a good thing, but yes, there are some issues. So first and foremost, the DUP. So they've set up a consultative panel of 8 people who are going to report back to the party leadership at the end of this month after consultation with party members and others, with some advice on how they should approach this deal. Fundamentally, the DUP will lose supporters whichever way it goes. So it will lose hardliners to traditional unionist voice, which is very strongly anti-protocol and pro-Brexit. So they will lose supporters to them if they accept the deal. They will lose supporters to the UUP if they don't accept the deal, most particularly, I think, amongst women and amongst younger unionist voters, because those two groups, those two cohorts are much more critical of the DUP for staying out of power sharing over this issue. They do not see the protocol as an issue of most concern. So following on from that, you see that the conditions are right for a sense of betrayal, perhaps by unionist leadership, which is extremely difficult to manage in Northern Ireland, but not something that we're not familiar with. The Stormont break, as Catherine's outlined there, this is a potential issue, and nationalist parties have been expressing some concern about it. Also, not least because, in theory at least, there is potential for 1/3 of the Assembly to put a halt to the application of EU law here, which could potentially lead to divergence north-south. Now, this is down the road, and really in theory at the moment, but there's a wariness there, and the details about that Stormont break and how much the Assembly will be involved and the scope of that Stormont break, all of those are to be worked out now in a statutory instrument to come before the Commons. So people will be scrutinising that very carefully. Also, a big issue is, I think, expectation management. There is a little worry that we could have a repeat of what we've had in the previous 2 versions of the protocol, the backstop and then Boris Johnson's, in that in the effort to present it in as fine a light as possible to all constituencies in Northern Ireland, there's a risk of confusion and misunderstanding around what it means. So, for example, the idea of 1,700 pages of EU law no longer applying in Northern Ireland, that's not actually quite the case. It's very much around GB businesses not having to necessarily comply with all of those in order to sell goods here, but it's not the case that Northern Ireland is not aligned to certain EU laws. For example, also expectations around when this will come into play. So there is necessarily a fairly long implementation period. So there needs to be patience and information given in that space, most particularly to GB businesses. And the question will be, will that happen as it needs to happen to minimize disruption? And then last but not least, as we're all aware, we do have the retained EU law bill that's still coming down the line. And there is this, I'll end where I began, which is in that better UK-EU relationship. Certainly it's improved over the protocol, necessarily so, but there is the potential for it to come under pressure once more politically and in practical terms if this retained EU law bill does come to pass. It has enormous implications for Northern Ireland's very complicated position as well. So that's one to keep an eye on. Ultimately, this is a really important step forward. And at this point going forward, we will see really that soft power of commitment that we've seen from the EU towards Northern Ireland over a long period of time tested once more, and also become more important to manage what is actually an even more complicated situation than it was a few weeks ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Katie. I think both those presentations have told us a great deal about where we stand now. Let me just pick you up right the point you raised right at the end was one of the questions I wanted to put to Catherine, and I will put a couple of questions of my own before opening up, but do put more questions into the Q&A because we'll get to the audience as soon as we can. Catherine, on the retained EU law bill, but more broadly on the issue of what you might call increasing divergence between GB and the rest of the EU, and therefore between GB and NI. Is the likelihood, particularly if they stick with the retained EU law bill, that this border, which Rishi Sunak has now said there is no sense of a border, is actually just going to get thicker all the time? Is that what we're heading for? A thicker and thicker border that becomes more and more noticeable as the months and years go
on? Thank you for that question. So the retained EU law bill, for those of you not familiar with the jargon, that's the bill currently going through Parliament, which sunsets all of retained EU law, the 3,745 pieces of it, by the 31st of December 2023. However, the retained EU law bill also gives some get-out clauses. In particular, in clause 1.2, it's possible for the UK government and the devolved to retain existing EU law on an indefinite basis. They can also delay the sunset, and they can also rewrite the provisions. Now, what's not clear from the bill, albeit that it's been said on the floor of the House, and there's been a commitment given to the Lords, is that the UK will carry on respecting its international obligations, including its obligations under the withdrawal agreement, which by implication includes the Northern Ireland Protocol. Legally, it's not clear how the government will do it, whether the government will actually use the powers in clause 1.2 to say the UK will carry on respecting, at least in respect of Northern Ireland. UK government's going to have to do it at the moment because, of course, there is no Northern Ireland Assembly to do this. That it will carry on respecting EU law in the areas listed in the protocol. But that brings us to the point that you raised, John, about does that mean that if there's greater divergence in the rest of GB, there will have to be more checks in respect of goods going into Northern Ireland because of the issue of divergence? Some people say, in reality, the retained EU law bill might be largely performative, and in fact, a large swathes of technical legislation will be kept, and therefore the issues about divergence are less apparent in practice than in theory. But of course, the EU's got quite a lot to worry about because, of course, it's relying on the government sticking to its word. And so the question then is, what will the Conservatives do in the context of the retained EU law bill? And if there's a change of government in 2024, what will Labour do? Now, it seems likely that any Labour government might push for some sort of alignment in respect of veterinary matters and in respect of SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary matters, which will reduce the need for a thicker border. But all of this is way down the line. There is one area it's worth noting where, although it's hidden, if you look at the Q&A from the Commission, I think it's on page 8 of the Q&A, they say that there will be dynamic alignment in respect of some aspects of plants and animals. And so, in fact, if Northern Ireland is committed under the Windsor Framework to carry on dynamically aligning, and for those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, dynamic alignment means that the Northern Ireland will keep on following all of the rules, and indeed it may well be that GB follows suit. Therefore, there may be less divergence in these highly technical areas than would first appear.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. And now for Katy, the question about what the DUP will do, perhaps you could just spell that out for another 30 seconds or so. I mean, technically, this agreement doesn't need to be approved in Parliament at all. And even if it did need to be approved in Parliament, the Labour Party said they're going to support it. So actually, there is a majority in Parliament for it, whatever happens to the hardline Brexiteers in the Tory party or the DUP. But on the other hand, the DUP has to decide whether to rejoin the executive, and that is a decision that the DUP would take on its own. How do you see those two things going together? The question of the Commons and the question of whether the DUP will rejoin the executive.
So the Commons vote is slightly unfortunate for the DUP because it risks demonstrating divisions in the party. So as I say, already we've got a couple of MPs. Gregory Campbell also came out the other day suggesting that he will vote against. So we know where they stand. Geoffrey Donaldson's the leader. Of course, he is an MP as well. The best we could probably hope for is that he would be wishing for the party to abstain. But if that happens, then we're demonstrating a demonstration of a split that the DUP is managing. It's a very diverse party. It's holding together an awful lot at the moment. And the expression of that split would be something that they would hope to avoid, but I think it's unavoidable. And in terms of going back into the executive, so this is a bit of a difficulty, right? So for the DUP, stepping out of the executive, refusing to nominate a speaker in the assembly and therefore not allowing the assembly to function, that has been exercising the most leverage it can. I do think it's worth remembering that the DUP didn't stand on that mandate. In its manifesto, it never says we won't go back into the executive over the issue of the protocol, and we won't allow the assembly to function. However, it has done that. That assembly election produced a result in which the DUP came in the second largest and therefore would be responsible for nominating a deputy first minister. And as such, I think it's going to be a lot to ask the party base to accept two things: the protocol, which has been so fundamentally opposed to for 18 months now, and also deputy first minister position. So I may be wrong, but I would be expecting a period of if the DUP's consultative panel says maybe we'll keep a watching brief on this, allow the party to at least give some warm noises in advance of the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, enough to allow President Biden to come and visit and shake some hands, but not enough to push the DUP then back into power sharing. Because I think there will be some negotiations. So this is why I'm talking about the soft power of commitment on both sides. What we don't want to see is this idea that, well, that's done and dusted now, and now we're going to walk away, because you'll expect to see then more dramatics from one party or another here to try and get attention back. So quietly getting down to the business of restoring the Assembly and Executive, which when it does get back up and running, has an enormously difficult task ahead of it.
Yep.
Given obviously the effects of not having those functioning for over a year in a cost of living crisis, etc., budget cuts, but also what the Windsor Framework means in practice for it.
And I think that relates to another question, actually one from the audience now, which was one of the things I was also going to ask about. John Hobley in the audience is asking, why do people say the Good Friday Agreement, which is about to have its 25th anniversary, was somehow intimately linked to the removal of a border between North and South. It wasn't really linked to that at all, but they treat it as if it is linked to that. And it also, the other question that I was going to ask you was, the DUP has been arguing that the Northern Ireland Protocol itself is a danger to the Good Friday Agreement. But the EU suggested that the Northern Ireland Protocol was a way of protecting the Good Friday Agreement. So there's completely opposite views of how these things relate to the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes, that's quite a weighty question, John. I will answer it as succinctly as possible. And that is to say, the Good Friday Belfast Agreement was obviously concluded in the context of UK and Ireland's membership of the European Union. And it's no coincidence that not just in the Declaration of Support for the Good Friday Agreement, but also in the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, prefaced by saying, as friendly neighbours and partners in the European Union, we are doing this because, of course, that partnership in the EU meant ever closer union at the time anyway. So the assumption was that there would be increasingly close relations between the two of them. That's the context for the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. A core part of the GFA is Strand 2, North-South cooperation, and we can't understand the Good Friday Agreement without thinking of those three strands: unionist, nationalist, balanced in Northern Ireland, North-South cooperation, and East-West cooperation, which is all Britain and Ireland. Notably, the open border, bearing in mind, basically, the Good Friday Agreement accepted that Northern Ireland would continue on in the United Kingdom against the wishes of nationalists, but they accepted because of Strand 2 and the conditions of the GFA. People associated with the Irish border being open with the success of the peace process. So research I was conducting in the central border region of Ireland, Northern Ireland during the withdrawal negotiations, it was very clear. People saw that open Irish border, as was actually enabled by a single market membership, as being a demonstration of the success of the GFA, and reassuring for nationalists, therefore, and fears about a hard border were particularly acute amongst nationalists. They would see it as a backward step for the Good Friday Agreement, bearing in mind that Northern Ireland was and has left the European Union against the wishes of a majority. To add a hard border to that into the mix would have seen as being politically untenable and unsustainable. But more to the point, I think we sort of actually should never lose sight of the fact that the practical management of a hard land border, with all that would be expected in the EU's external border, bearing in mind 500 kilometres with 270 odd crossing points, that practically is simply just not feasible in a way that managing the sea border with 7 entry points in sea and air was seen as being. So ultimately, it was a sort of a pragmatic decision, but we saw, of course, then the political complexities around that and the sensitivities. And the Windsor Framework, as I say, it's pretty red, white, and blue, but that's to try and set a rebalance there. But constantly in NI, you're trying to deal with this fragile balance because it's integrated with the South and with Britain as well.
It's sort of really all about different interpretations. And Catherine, a question from Peter Wilson-Smith about the Stormont break. You may have seen it at the Q&A. What does it apply to? But just to build on that, does it apply to he's asking, does it apply to the updating of existing rules or only to new rules? But just generally, I think your point was that it's slightly like the emergency brake that Norway in theory has in the European Economic Area, which Norway has in practice never used, which suggests that using this emergency brake would be an extremely difficult thing to do.
Yes, thank you. I agree with that. So there is a difference between amended legislation, which can be in principle subject to the Stormont brake, and new legislation, which is in fact already subject to what some people call the Westminster brake. Now, they have different restrictions around them. So in respect to the Stormont brake, as I've indicated to you, it needs to be used only in the most exceptional circumstances, as a last resort, and in respect of measures which have a significant effect on day-to-day life. The Westminster brake, which applies to the inclusion of new legislation doesn't have any of those caveats in it. So in fact, the Westminster break is more generous to the UK. So if new legislation is being adopted, then under Article 13.4, the EU's got to inform the UK in the joint committee. And if the UK accepts the new legislation, then a decision will be adopted, adding the newly adopted bit of legislation to the list, which applies in Northern Ireland. Indeed, a number of bits of legislation have already gone through that route. If, however, the UK objects to that piece of legislation under the Westminster break, then the obligation is to carry on talking to try and find some sort of solution. Now, what you don't have with the Westminster break is all of those caveats that I mentioned before about it being exceptional circumstances and so forth. Now, it may well be that in respect of existing EU legislation, which is being amended, this is more likely to happen more often than a lot of new legislation, because although we spend a lot of time talking about new EU legislation, the volume of EU legislation has declined significantly in recent years, not least because much of the free movement of goods has already been extensively regulated by the EU, and that extensive regulation already applies in Northern Ireland. It just needs to be updated. So on a day-to-day basis, the updating is likely to be a more common occurrence than the experience of facing new legislation. And the stormwater break applies to the updating, the amendment, not the new legislation. Fundamental problem that may arise down the line is what happens if the EU adopts a new measure, but in the course of adopting the new measure, it also has some twiddly bits in it which amend and update other measures. Will it be subject to the stormwater break or the Westminster break?
It's nicely complicated for everybody. And it actually does bring in, to some extent, another question from Anne Dayton. It's a slightly complicated question, so I won't rehearse it all through. But one of the things she's asking is, how long is this all going to take? What's the timeline? I mean, I think I might put this one to Katy first, because obviously you've got to get a vote on this agreement. Then you've got to get it implemented, and then you've got to talk about how it's going to work. Then you've got to consider the situation of the executive. I mean, this is all going to take quite a long time, bearing in mind that we're only perhaps sort of 18 months away from, or even less, from a UK election, which might change everything.
Yes, I mean, the timeline that we can work out according to the Windsor Framework is up to summer 2025. So we know, so they're expecting that. And in between times, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that, as Catherine mentioned, we have the democratic consent vote, so-called, in the Northern Ireland Assembly at the end of next year, which is on Articles 5 to 10. So that'll be one to watch. And the UK government is committed to having an independent review if that vote is only passed on the basis of a simple majority. And then if it needs to be, it could go back to the Joint Committee for more decisions or adjustment in relation to the protocol, such as it would be able to do. So this is definitely going to be evolving, and I think this is just as we were, I think at some point was hoping to be able to get to a de-dramatization. Do you remember that time when it was about de-dramatizing the protocol?
Michelle Barnard's favourite word.
Yes, so exactly, and that was never possible. I think it would be potentially possible over the Windsor Framework, but a lot does depend on A, if we have an assembly up and running, and B, if they are doing so, if they're able to manage this. One thing will be really important will be the capacity of the assembly to scrutinise the EU legislation that will apply here, and the amount of engagement that they will have there. They never really took that role on fully, even in terms of having a dedicated committee when we were in the EU. So it's asking quite a lot of our legislators, but it will all depend on the politics around it, because as things come in, for example, those not for EU labels, if people wanted to, they could become contentious. They could be used in certain ways, as we saw, in 2021, things being used, and so then the hope would be that you do have a better UK-EU relationship, therefore British-Irish relationship, therefore responsible government legislators here to be able to avoid flare-ups.
Well, good luck with that. We're getting close to running out of time, but I think we could run for another five or 7 minutes. But I think, although Paul Lever's also asked an interesting question, let me save that for the end if we have time for it, and ask Catherine a bit more about, for example, sorry, they're just recording. For example, the illegal migrants bill, which is not necessarily going to be popular in Europe. And as we know, Rishi Sunak, for all his charm, and the dear Rishi, is a committed Brexiteer. He thinks the EU is a terrible organisation. What do you think about the future?
Yeah, I think, I mean, clearly there was warm body language between Rishi Sunak and Ursula von der Leyen. And we also see a degree of pragmatism by Rishi Sunak because he wants to have a diplomatic win and show he's able to stride the diplomatic stage in contrast to his two predecessors. But as you say, he's still got to deal with his predecessors who are still on manoeuvres in government. I think the positive thing that's come out to me from the Windsor Agreement is that the ERG have not really barked yet. And I'm very surprised at how little attention has been paid to the fact that the ECJ still has a role. And the presentation of that essentially it has a role, but it's a very, very tiny role, has been quite clever. But as you say, you've got the illegal migration bill going through Parliament, which is absolutely on the borders of compatibility with the Refugee Convention. And the very fact that the government was not able to make a statement to say it's compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights suggests that the bill is leading us to thumbing our nose at a minimum at the European Convention on Human Rights. And that raises quite big issues for the EU because respect for the European Convention on Human Rights and generally respect for human rights is one of the so-called essential elements for continued compatibility with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And it's not just the illegal migration bill, but also it's a retained EU law bill, which on its face does really significant damage to our continued respect of our obligations under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, particularly under the so-called level playing field provisions. Those are the provisions on environmental rights and workers' rights. Now, it could come good on the night if the UK decides to save vast tracts of that legislation. But if it does not, and we do breach the level playing field provisions, we're back to where we were before, and there will be serious talk of a trade war.
So you might conclude from that it may be too early to say that Brexit is definitively done yet. Katy, last word from you, just in answer to Paul Lever's question. He's worried about what might happen in the unionist community, particularly on the far right, the Alistair party, the TUV. Mm-hmm. If the DUP is more amenable, is there a risk that the far right will be stirred up even more? And possibly, what will the paramilitaries do?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, that is a question. I mean, in answer to Paul's point there, I mean, the TV only have one seat. We shouldn't forget that. They could well do better in the next elections whenever they happen, but they're unlikely to grow very significantly as a party. Jim Alistair plays an important role in the Assembly, not least he's very thorough in procedures, etc. So he would be missing that sense. I don't think they will boycott the Assembly. We do have a concern around loyalists and how they respond. And certainly when I've engaged with some loyalist communities since we've seen this announcement, there is predictions of violence if the framework is accepted. And we know that they are capable of managing and manipulating that through all sorts of means. I think the most serious threat to the peace process here is our undermining of the democratic system, and this has happened considerably over the last while with not having functioning assembly executive, and therefore I think we should not underestimate the significance of the decision that the DUP has to make, and why it's important that in making a decision, it explains it carefully, the reasons for that decision, and why it would and that it would take on responsibility for having made that decision, including the commitment to democracy here and to peace, and having no ambiguity anymore about the role or use of violence in Northern Ireland 25 years after the Good Friday Belfast Agreement.
It is perhaps just worth reminding our audience that a majority of people in Northern Ireland did not vote for Brexit, just as a majority have generally supported the operation of the protocol. But the politics of Northern Ireland are, as I'm sure the audience will appreciate, quite complicated. I think with that, I'll say thank you to both our participants and then hand the floor back to Antonia briefly.
Yes, a warm thank you also from me to everyone. On the one hand, our speakers for the really informative and insightful discussion, and also to all the members in the audience for asking your very interesting questions. The BGA still has an exciting programme of events coming up this month and in the next few months. We have an interview with the German ambassador to the UK on the 27th of March, and we have events with two historians. On the one hand, Katy Hayward about her new book, Beyond the Wall, East Germany, 1949 to 1990. That's coming up on the 5th of April. And also an event with Sir Christopher Clark, in May on his new book, Revolutionary Spring, Fighting for a New World, 1848 to 1849. So lots of interesting events coming up. Thank you very much again for joining us, and I hope you all have a good evening.
Thanks very much.
Bye.